There are some individuals that have left such an indelible mark on history, for good or bad, that just the mention of their initials is enough that most people would know immediately who you're referring to. For instance, if I said JFK, who do you think of right away? John Kennedy, 35th President of the United States. Nearly everyone would recognize that. There's another man that's so well known to history that his initials are universally recognized pretty much. That's FDR. Who's FDR? Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the 32nd President of the United States. That Roosevelt had a lasting impact on the fabric of the history of our nation is beyond doubt. What is debated sometimes is whether that impact was for good or bad. Truth be told, FDR could be given credit for some successes and some failures. If longevity in office is a sign of success, then he was greatly successful. He was president longer than anyone else in the history of our nation. He held the office for 12 years from 1933 until his death in 1945. When George Washington refused to run for a third term in 1796, he set a precedent that was unbroken for 144 years. But in 1940, as Roosevelt's second term was drawing to a close, Europe was embroiled in World War II. His promise to keep America out of that war propelled him to unprecedented heights of popularity. He accepted the party's nomination and won the election handily. He had a 55% of the vote, of the popular vote, and 85% of the electoral college. To some historians, he's often considered, alongside Washington and Lincoln, who are considered to be the best presidents in history. Successes attributed to his leadership in the eyes of some were that he was able to bring the U.S. through the Great Depression and through World War II. His legacy, however, can be equally marked by his failures and what many consider the irreparable harm done to our country, damage that's remained for 3/4 of a century. The immense size of our government today, and if you're a conservative, you have to agree, our government is way too large. The immense size of our government today can be attributed to its growth under his leadership. In addition, government regulation and control climbed to new heights under his watch, and could reasonably be argued that our current welfare system wouldn't have existed without his help. But aside from these things, and I think more importantly, I believe that Roosevelt's greatest failures can be attributed to his moral shortcomings, and they were obvious. One of his first executive decisions following America's entry into World War II was the establishment of internment camps in our country, where anyone with a 1/16 or more of a bloodline descended from Japanese stock was forced to be held. No less than 100,000 American citizens were held in these internment camps, while at the same time these Japanese families had sons who were serving our army in the European theater. Some of them died preserving the freedoms that their parents weren't able to enjoy because they were held hostage in the camps. Another moral failure was when, even though he signed an executive order banning discrimination in the defense industry, he failed to keep his promise to desegregate the armed services, a fact disclosed in movies of recent years like the Tuskegee Airmen. African Americans under Roosevelt's administration were good enough to die for our freedom, but not good enough to be housed with or to serve with white troops. He had some moral failures. But by far the greatest and grossest failure of his moral character had to be in dealing with God's chosen people, the Jews. Hitler's final solution, as it would come to be known, resulted in the extermination of some 6 million European Jews in the Holocaust. For a decade, beginning in the 1930s, Jewish people were desperate to escape the ravages of Hitler's drive to wipe them out. They would reach out to anybody and everybody that they possibly could for help, to anyone who would listen to their pleas. Roosevelt was silent in the 1930s as Hitler began this anti-Semitic project of genocide. He remained silent in 1940 when a ship by the name of the St. Louis sailed from Hamburg, Germany. There were nearly 1,000 German and European Jews on that ship escaping or trying to escape the Holocaust. They got as far as Havana, Cuba, and were turned away. They weren't allowed to land in Havana. And so they came north just 100 miles to Florida and were refused entrance into Florida. That ship had to turn around and go back to Europe with those Jews still on it. He was silent again in 1941 when his State Department would not permit the unused refugee quotas to be applied to Jewish refugees seeking entrance in the United States. They were turned away. Yet again, he was mute in 1942 when news arrived of the extermination of millions of Jews in the Nazi death camps. He refused to meet with Jewish leaders who asked for help and even denied his own Secretary of the Interior's request to use the Virgin Islands as a refugee camp for fleeing Jews. Finally, in 1944, Roosevelt refused to order the bombing of the Auschwitz gas chambers and railroads leading there, even though they were already bombing oil and rubber installations adjoining Auschwitz. He would not permit the bombers to bomb the gas chambers. President Roosevelt could have helped, but he didn't lift a finger. His conscious decisions not to act left the Jewish people without aid and vulnerable to Hitler's killing machine. 6 million Jewish people died as a result. FDR's greatest failures, make no mistake about it, they were in the realm of morals. Societal groups and nations, like individuals, can also fail in many areas. They can fail politically, as we looked at 2 weeks ago. They can fail religiously, as we looked at last week. And they can fail morally. And one can trace a downward spiral in those three areas so that those who degenerate to the point of moral failure in a society approach the closest place to the end of that society. That brings us to the subject of today's study and the title, An Immoral People. In our first study of Isaiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, we saw that Judah had rebelled against God in their political life. That was their life relating to the government or their leaders. In last week's study of verses 10 through 20, we saw that they had rebelled against God in their religious life. In other words, their worship was ruined. They no longer worshiped the God of the universe. Today we see the third and final way that Judah had rebelled against God, and that was in their moral life. Having given up the political foundation of a fair and just governing body, they'd become a political failure. Having given up the spiritual foundation of a God-centered worship system, they had become a religious failure. As a matter of logical downward spiral, without the safe political confines of government and the safe religious confines of a God-centered worship system, any people, and this is whether you're talking about the Jews in Israel or here in the United States, any people will naturally degenerate into immorality. And Judah had done just that. So we start today in verse 21 by considering the moral failure of Jerusalem. The moral failure of Jerusalem. Look at verse 21. How the faithful city has become a harlot. Those are God's words. How the faithful city has become a harlot. Now this section, the whole section we're looking at this morning, is filled with metaphoric language. God is drawing word pictures in order to make a point in such a way that they're not missed. And so he starts with a word picture here. Begins with the word how. Interestingly enough, in English, whenever we start any sentence with the word how, in most cases, not in every case, but in most cases, we're beginning a sentence. How do I find Mannheim? How do I cook pork on the grill. We start our sentences, many of them, with the word how. In English. But in Hebrew, and the word that's translated how there is the word ekah. It can be an interrogative, which means you can start a Hebrew sentence with the word how and ask a question. But often, as in the case here, that is not what is happening. In Hebrew, the word ekah can also be used to introduce an exclamation. It starts a sentence that presents something that is amazing or astonishing. And so in verse 21, God is not saying, how has the faithful city become a harlot? He is saying how the faithful city has become a harlot. In other words, God is saying it is astonishing that this city, and of course we're talking about Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. God is saying it is astonishing that this city, in spite of all the other cities of the world, this city has become a harlot. Jerusalem was a faithful city one time. Now, the metaphor here is a metaphor of a marriage. You have a wife and a husband. Jerusalem is looked at as the wife of Yahweh, God. Actually, the entire nation of Israel was considered throughout the Old Testament to be the wife of God. But in this case, he uses this metaphor in reference to Jerusalem. It was at one time a faithful city, and it had become a harlot. Now, how had it become unfaithful? Well, in order to understand where they were then, you have to understand where they came from. You see there, remember I told you last week that in 931, after Solomon died, the nation of Israel was no longer a nation. It split into two kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The southern kingdom that was the tribe of Judah primarily and Benjamin. The southern kingdom is what had the city of Jerusalem, the capital city. It was that city where God put his temple. It was that city where all the Jews from all over the world, when they would come to worship, they came to that city. That was the only place that was acceptable to worship God, was in Jerusalem. And under the reigns of Solomon and then David, which was when they were still united, they hadn't split up yet, under the reigns of Solomon and David, the city was a faithful city. Solomon followed his father David. They neither one of them were perfect, but they loved God, they obeyed God, and they followed God. And so during their reigns, Jerusalem was considered a faithful city. After the split, after the Civil War, the North and the South Kingdom, that was no longer the case. Throughout the history of that southern kingdom, there were some kings that were good kings. And when those kings reigned, Jerusalem became faithful once again to a certain degree. When the other kings reigned, the evil kings, the bad kings, Jerusalem was not a faithful city. It was a despicable, wicked city. And so God says, how the faithful city has become a harlot. She who was full of justice. There was a time when justice was meted out properly in Jerusalem. There was a story you probably remember in 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon was king. Two women were both prostitutes, and they lived in the same house together. Ironically, they had both become pregnant, and they both delivered a baby. The two babies were only a couple of days apart. One night they went to sleep, and one of the babies died. The mother of the baby that died woke up in the middle of the night, noticed that her baby was dead, and so she took her dead baby over to the other mother with the living baby and swapped babies. She left the dead baby where the living baby was. She took the living baby over to her bed, and in the morning they woke up, and the lady that had the living baby saw that this baby was dead, but immediately recognized it wasn't her baby. And so what did they do? Well, they went to King Solomon. This was going to be a difficult question for him to handle. Both of them said, the living baby is mine. The dead baby is not mine. And it was basically a he said, she said, but it was a she said, she said. They disagreed. How could Solomon ever be able to determine which one was lying and which one was telling the truth? Well, he came up with an idea. He said, bring me a sword. Take the baby and take the sword and we will cut the living baby in half, and we'll split the baby up. Give half to one mother, half to the other mother. That solves the problem. Well, the mother whose baby had died basically said, yeah, that sounds good to me. That's fair. The other mother, who was the real mother of that baby, said, no way. Do not kill that baby. Rather than kill that baby, give that baby to her. Immediately, Solomon knew who the real mother was. And so Solomon gave the child to its rightful mother. During that time, God said that city was a faithful city. Justice was given out properly in that city at that time. Look at verse 21 again, middle of the verse. Righteousness once lodged in her. You could depend on going to the leadership of the city if you were Jewish at that time. You could depend on getting fair treatment. You could depend on getting a fair hearing before the judges. That no longer was the case. The end of verse 21, God says, but now murderers. Now murderers. That all had changed. Morality had been replaced by immorality. Society had degenerated. Look at verse 22. Your silver has become dross. Another metaphor. Silver has become dross. Silver is a metal that has a worth even to us today. It's worth so much. That silver can be either perfectly pure or it can have a little bit of alloy in it, which degenerates its worth, but it's still worth something. But dross is the impurity that's removed from alloyed silver in order to make it pure. The dross has no value at all. There is no silver in the dross. And so God says, your silver has become dross. In other words, their morality in Jerusalem hadn't been mixed up, had not become a little bit immoral. It was replaced by immorality. There was no morality anymore, totally replaced by immorality. He goes on, he says, your drink diluted with water. If you have, and they're talking about wine, if you had wine and you poured a little bit of water in it, there's no way that little bit of water was going to stay anywhere in the wine. It was going to spread throughout the whole glass of the wine. It was entirely polluted. He says in verse 23, your rulers are rebels. Your rulers are rebels. Though those who had been given the responsibility of being the leaders, of making the decisions, of making the judgments in Jerusalem, had now rebelled against God. You couldn't even trust them anymore. Your rulers have become rebels and companions of thieves. And then look at this. He says, everyone loves a bribe and chases after rewards. And I'm thinking Washington, D.C. The lobbyists go into our rulers and with money attempt to change votes, get something approved that benefits them or the people that the lobbyists or the people they represent, and all too often it works. Look at the end of verse 23. It says, they do not defend the orphan, nor does the nor does the widow's plea come before them. Bribes are taken for rewards. Orphans and widows are not treated fairly. We have such a similar atmosphere in our country today, especially in places of leadership. You know, down in Washington, D.C., those are our supposed rulers or leaders. They call them Republicans and Democrats. Neither one of those, Republicans or Democrats, are perfect. Republicans certainly aren't perfect. The problem is the Democrats are so bad that it makes all the Republicans look like saints. We have such a mess in our leadership. God says the widow's plea, the orphan and the widow's plea doesn't come before these leaders. You know, in Exodus chapter 22, God says to the Jews, you shall not afflict any widow or orphan. The quality of a biblical society was defined by its care of the defenseless and the helpless. We don't even hardly see that in our society anymore. Jerusalem, the city where God lived, had degenerated into an immoral society. Immorality is on the rise and in control more in our nation than at any time in our lifetimes. And you know what's interesting? God would not permit that to stand in Jerusalem. And He is not going to permit that to stand in our country today. Who knows but what the problems that we suffer in America today are a result of our turning our back on God and degenerating into an increasingly immoral society. I was watching the news this morning. There are several cities across the country that are having talks right now about defunding their police departments. We're going to quit paying the cops. And since you aren't paying the cops, obviously the cops are going to have to quit, so there will be no cops. There are actually people in our country today that believe it's a good idea that there aren't any cops. Do you see what happens when a society degenerates into immorality? There isn't even any logic. There isn't even any reason that stands behind their decisions. The mayor of Minneapolis is where the black fellow was killed last week or died last week at the hands of not a good cop. That's where the protests started. That's where the riots started. Now they've, of course, spread all across the country. Well, the mayor of Minneapolis, it was either yesterday or the day before, he went to a Black Lives Matter rally. Everybody recognized the mayor, and so somebody asked him one question. And the question was, will you promise to defund the police department in Minneapolis? And to his credit, he shook his head no. That was the last thing he was able to do. He was booed out of this massive rally. They wouldn't listen to him anymore. Didn't want to hear anything he would say. There are that many people that wanted to see the police departments unfunded. Morality had in Israel, in Jerusalem, had degenerated to such a low point. And I'm looking at our country today and thinking, what's the difference? We're in just as bad shape as they were. So there was a moral failure in Jerusalem. Number two, though, the next thing I want to consider is a mandated fix of Jerusalem. A mandated fix of Jerusalem. It's in verses 24 to 26. God will not allow immorality to stand forever. Look at verse 24. Therefore is a word that's a connective word that connects what's been said with what's about to be said. Since, in other words, all this immorality has existed, God is saying, this is what I'm going to do. Therefore, the Lord, God of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, declares. Notice that there are three terms that God used to describe himself there. The Lord, the God of hosts, and the mighty one of Israel. That word Lord in your English Bible, you'll notice it's an uppercase L and a lowercase O-R-D. There are two ways that you see the English word Lord, actually three ways, but the two primary ones. Either they're all uppercase, L-O-R-D, all uppercase, or like it is here, uppercase L, small O-R-D. When you see all uppercase, it comes from the Hebrew word that is, we would translate it in English, Yehovah or Yahweh. It's the name of God. It talks about who exactly God is. That's not the case here. This is uppercase L, small O-R-D. It comes from the Hebrew word Adonai. Adonai. It's primarily a word that means and is usually translated as master or owner. In other words, God is saying, I own Jerusalem. I am the master of that city. Then he goes on, he says, the God of hosts, Yahweh Zevaot is the Hebrew. It means God of the army. And not only is God saying, I own that city, but I've got an army and I'm going to clean up that city. And then he says, the mighty one of Israel, the God who has all the power. He declares this, I will be relieved of my adversaries and avenge myself on my foes. Now, the adversaries and the foes were not outsiders. These were Jewish leaders in the capital city of Jerusalem. God says, I will be relieved of my adversaries, meaning they're going to go away. And they weren't being sent into exile. I will be relieved of my adversaries and avenge myself on my foes. When God says, I will avenge myself on my foes, what he's basically meaning is, we're going to go at it, me and you do not want to be standing against God. In our country, in our society, we have for so long turned our back on God. We now live in a degenerated society that basically looks at God and says, we don't care what you say, we're going to do what we want to do. And God is saying, no, you're not. You'll go so far, but you will not do what you want to do. Verse 25. He says, I will also turn my hand against you and will smelt away your dross as with lye. That impurity that has taken over the purity, that was all that was left of the silver, God says. It's all waste, it's all worthless. God says, I'm going to get rid of it. Smelt away your dross as with lye, and remove all your alloy. There is coming a time, by the way, this has not happened yet. There is coming a time when the city of Jerusalem will be entirely cleaned up in God's eyes. There will be no more dross. There will be no more alloy. The silver will be pure. Righteousness will once again reign. Justice once again will be meted out properly. There's only one time, and it's never happened in history, there's only one time even in the future that that's going to happen. This is pointing to the ultimate righteousness in Jerusalem during the millennial reign of Christ. It's looking ahead. Then he says in verse 26, then I will restore your judges at the first, and your counselors at the beginning. There will come a time when you will, in Jerusalem, you will be able to go to the judges, to go to the counselors, and know they're going to give you a fair hearing. They're going to listen honestly to your case, and they're going to judge righteously. There will be no bribes. There will be no crooked rulers. God promises there's a fix. There's a way to fix this, and I will fix it. At the end of verse 26, he says, after that, you will be called the city of righteousness, a faithful city. The city of righteousness, a faithful city. That's a day to look ahead to in the millennium kingdom. It's not in our time. But it's a promise God is making to the Jewish people. It's a promise not to be forgotten. And there's hope for the Jew today who believes in God because they can trust that this is going to come about. You know, when I look at all this unrighteousness in Jerusalem and the despicable immorality that was there at the time, I look at my own country, America, and I have to ask, what hope is there for America? Well, actually, there's bad news and good news. Let me start with the bad news. And that is, when you study Scripture and you study the prophecy in Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, you know how many times in Old Testament, New Testament prophecy you can find a pretty clear indication that's referring to the United States? Zero. None. That means that sometime between now and then, this country is either not existing anymore or has completely lost its influence and power in the world anymore. That's the good news. Well, what is the good news? That's the bad news. What is the good news? The good news is that God can still heal. Something I pray for every day. I challenged last week, and I'd like to challenge you again. Every day, pray for our nation. Pray for our leaders. Pray that God will raise up righteousness and silence evil. It's happened before. You're not old enough to remember, and neither am I, the First Great Awakening, 1734 to 1743. It started by the preaching of one man, a man by the name of Jonathan Edwards in Northampton, Massachusetts, and it spread from there. People were saved. The second awakening was under Charles Finney, 1800 to 1840. He was an evangelist. It's estimated that some 500,000 people might have come to Christ through the preaching of Charles Finney. Third time it happened was during the Civil War. It was called the Civil War Revival, 1861 to 1865. Now those soldiers were being shot at and wounded, and many of them killed. It's estimated that during the Civil War there were approximately 300,000 soldiers that gave their lives to Christ. The urban revivals came next, 1875 to 1885. You've perhaps heard of a man by the name of D.L. Moody, Dwight Moody, in Chicago, preaching the gospel. Many came to Christ. And number 5 was the Welsh revival. That's an interesting study in history. Get online, Google, do a search. The Welsh revival broke out in Wales, 1904 to 1905. You know what's interesting? So many people got saved in the cities in Wales that they actually did defund the police departments. Not because they didn't want to have cops, but because they didn't need them. Things changed so dramatically. That revival came across the pond, as they say. It landed in America in between 1905 and 1906. Do you remember a guy by the name of Billy Sunday? He preached the gospel in those years. It's estimated that there may have been 1 million people that came to faith in Christ through the preaching of Billy Sunday. Number 6 was post-World War II awakening, 1947 and 1948. Lots of people came home from the war. They saw the bloodbath, what was happening over in Europe and in the Pacific, and they gave their lives to Christ. And then number 7, who can forget the ministry of Billy Graham? Probably has preached to more people on earth than any other evangelist in history. So God's done it before. I know that he can do it again. So there was a moral failure. There was a mandated fix. And thirdly and finally, I want to consider the miraculous faithfulness of Jerusalem. The miraculous faithfulness of Jerusalem. It wasn't faithful then. It's still not faithful today, but it will be one day. Look at verse 27. God says, Zion will be redeemed with justice. Zion is another name for Jerusalem. It will be redeemed with justice. Redeem means to buy back. They're lost in immorality. They're lost in sin. God says, I'm going to buy them back. And her repentant ones with righteousness. There will be people in Jerusalem that will confess their sins and give their lives over to Christ. At the end of the tribulation period, this has never happened in the history of the world before, and it will never happen again. One time, at the end of the tribulation period, when you study the book of Revelation, you see that the entirety of all the Jews that are left, 2/3 of them will be gone. There's only 1/3 left. But of all the Jews that are left, the entirety of that nation will en masse turn to Jesus Christ and seek forgiveness. Are repentant ones with righteousness. Verse 28. But transgressors and sinners will be crushed together. And those who forsake the Lord will come to an end. The immorality will not be allowed to stand. Verse 29, God says, surely you will be ashamed of the oaks which you have desired, and you will be embarrassed at the gardens which you have chosen. What's this about oaks and gardens? There are two worship cults that took place in Israel during these Old Testament days. One was the cult of the tree cult, it was called. And I shared this with you before. Throughout Israel, everywhere that there was a hill and there was a tree on the hill, they built an altar under the tree. Bible scholars today aren't exactly sure why that was. It might have been something like worshiping nature. There are a lot of people today that worship nature. We talk about Mother Earth. There was also a garden cult. Don't know why that was either, but for some reason these people believed that when they were in their gardens, they were in a holy place and they were closer to their gods. And apparently by the language here, the Jews had been sucked into those false worship practices. And so he says in verse 29, surely you will be ashamed of the oaks which you have desired. Jewish people that were drawn into this false worship of pagan gods, God says, you're going to be ashamed of that someday. And you will be embarrassed at the gardens that you have chosen. All of that false worship is going to go away. Verse 30, he says, you will be like an oak whose leaf fades away, or a garden that has no water. Looks like some of the flowers that die around our house in the summertime. When there's a drought, they get all wilted and they look pathetic. And I tell Janet, why don't we just plow them all under and start all over again? She says, no, they can be saved. That's what God can do. He can save the most lost, the most despicable. Verse 31 says, the strong man will become tinder, his work also a spark. Thus they shall both burn together, and there will be none to quench them. God promises that there's coming a day when the immorality, the unrighteousness, the lack of justice is all going to be done away with. And those who practice it will be destroyed by judgment. No different here in our country. You know, we're living in the midst of a more immoral society than any time in our lives. As a nation, we followed the path of Judah and Jerusalem in Old Testament times. I told you last week, 1962, we removed prayer from schools. 1963, we removed Bible reading from schools. 1973, we removed human life. Abortion became allowed throughout the land. So as they did, we've turned against God politically. The Ten Commandments, which at one time were followed in our country, not so much anymore. They no longer govern our judicial system. Prayer and Bible reading's gone. Murder and rape are no longer subject to capital punishment in most cases. Always true of rape, but it's usually true of murder. Then too, like Jerusalem, like Judah, we've turned our back on God in our religious area. Agnosticism and atheism are growing in our country. The average person on the street, especially in our larger cities today, if you go up to them and talk about God, they have no concept of who you're even referring to or what He requires. More and more churches in our country have become reprobate, not even teaching the true gospel anymore. People who attend churches and sit under watered-down preaching week after week, and when they die and they don't know it, but all they have to look forward to is judgment under the wrath of a holy God. Finally, our society is rapidly turning into a completely immoral society. In the eyes of so many, there's no right and wrong. All that matters is what's right or wrong for the individual. There is no absolute truth, according to a lot of people, only relative truth. You know, what's true for you may not be what's true for me. But the truth of the matter is there is a truth. There is an absolute truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He also said, no man comes to the Father, no one comes to the Father, but by me. You know, God doesn't change, and the truth doesn't change. You and I need to be seeking opportunities every day to help people see that the one and the only solution to their problems and the solution to all of society's problems is found in Jesus, the Messiah of God. Those cities that we're seeing today being burned out, looted and riot, people being killed, the only solution for those cities isn't more law, because we've already got laws that aren't even enforced anymore. The solution certainly isn't to defund the police departments and hope for the best that human nature has to offer, because human nature doesn't have anything good to offer. By nature, every one of us are sinners. The only solution to the problems in those cities, in our nation, in our society, there's one answer to that, and it's Jesus Christ. You and I need to be telling people about that every single day. Every opportunity we have, tell them about Jesus. That's the only hope we have for our nation. I pray for that every day. I hope you do too. And if you don't, if you haven't already, please join me in doing that. Let's close in prayer.